Today, I'm going to move pretty fast to just ensure that it gets done. Continue to take some good notes, especially the stuff that's underlined. I think that'll be really the main things that you need to retain moving forward. Originally, we were going to have an SAQ over all of this, but I was looking over my grades and I was looking over the fact that really I want everyone to really put their energies into the notebook check at the end of the week. So we are not going to have the SAQ. We're not going to do it today. We're not going to do it tomorrow. I just deleted that out of the grade book. So, I mean, really, the reason I did it was I don't want you to have any more to worry about really this week than that notebook check, because it's the notebook check that's going to have the huge impact on your grade. Remember, notebook check, it's daily grade, but it averages together with the first one for your final test grade. So that's really what I want you to spend your time on. I don't want you to have to worry about SAQ, so we ain't even doing it. That means, though, as far as improving your grade, you're limited a little bit. You've got the notebook, that's huge. You can do test retakes. If you failed the test last week, you can do retakes. Just keep in mind, if the reason you failed is you did it like 3 days late or 4 days late, you can still retake it, but you're still losing those points that you had deducted for being late. Just kind of keep that in mind, but you can still certainly retake it, and we can go from there. But the final thing you can do, and this is easy, guys, the historical documentary review essay, guys, that is me just trying to help you. So look it over, get it turned in on time. That is going to be due Monday before midnight. So there's still stuff you can do, but it's getting limited. We're getting towards the end. So you need to be proactive and definitely make sure that the stuff that we have right now, you get done, you do correctly, you get done on time. Other than that, AP exam deposits, you need to get that done by Friday. This is all online. We're not accepting any money here on campus. You have to pay through that total registration website. So if you think you want to take this thing, that is the place. So definitely get it done. So yesterday, we finished up the Ottoman Empire. They're the main ones you need to know the most about. But we still have the Safavids and the Mughals to take care of today, and we will take care of them today. When you think of the Ottoman Empire, we think Turkey. When you think of the Mughal Empire that we're going to talk about next, you think more or less India. When you think of the Safavids, think modern-day Iran. Now, they've got an issue. They're kind of stuck. Their book ended between the Mughals and the Ottomans, so there's not a whole lot of area to expand, at least to the east or the west. Plus, the empires they're surrounded by are Muslim just like them, but they're not just like them. The Ottomans and the Mughals are Sunni Muslims. The Safavids are Shiites. And that creates an issue for them, especially with the Ottomans, because along their borders, there's almost constant conflict. The Ottomans hated the Safavids hated the Ottomans. It's one of the reasons neither one of them advanced much further than they do. And really, this just deepens the rivalry between Sunnis and Shiites that we still see to this day. Iran and Iraq have fought numerous wars against each other. A lot of it is really rooted in that differing view of Islam. So to kind of introduce the Safavids for you, and then I'll fill in the blanks, we're going to watch our first video. Originally, I hadn't planned on any videos today because we were going to try to squeeze in the SAQ, but by eliminating that, we can get to the videos. I do think that'll help. As you watch this video, just kind of pay attention to what the Safavids are doing, what they're known for, what sort of things they do that help improve their situation, what sort of things that they do that frankly lead to their decline. We'll handle the Safavids real quick after this. I only got 2 slides, and then the rest of the class, we will continue on with the moves. So watch and enjoy the Safavid Empire.
Once known as Persia, the area encompassing and surrounding modern-day Iran has seen many empires rise and fall. One of these empires is the Safavid. Today we'll take a look at this ruling power that governed over Iran during the 16th and 17th centuries. According to many historians, the Safavid Empire marked the beginning of modern Persia. As an empire, the Safavids succeeded in placing the nomadic people groups of the region under their consolidated power. One of the main ways they did this was through religion. According to many sources, the Safavid Empire had its beginnings in Sufism, a mystical sect of Islam. However, as time went on, the empire moved closer to Shiism, a sect of Islam that believes all religious authority must come from the direct lineage of Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law. Believing that all other religions were heresy, the Safavids used their strong military force to force their Islamic Shiism to surrounding areas. In other words, it was definitely not an empire known for its tolerance. On the contrary, many would call it a theocracy, or a government formed and ruled by religious beliefs and rulers. As a theocracy, the Safavid rulers used their religious authority as a means to reign with rather unquestioned supremacy. Speaking of rulers, Shah Ismail is traditionally considered the first ruler of the Safavid Empire. Maybe a bit like America's George Washington, it was Shah Ismail who freed the Persians from the Ottoman Empire of modern-day Turkey. Moving further along in Persian history is Shah Abbas the Great. As his name implies, most scholars consider him to be the greatest emperor of the Safavids. Using the power of his theocracy, Shah Abbas strengthened the position of the emperor by limiting the power of local nobles. In other words, he let everyone know he was the head honcho in charge. Moving a bit away from politics, Shah Abbas the Great also enlarged the coffers of his empire. Being a bit of an opportunist, he opened up the doors of the empire to trade with Western powers, specifically the British. As the quite well-rounded ruler, Shah Abbas' rule also saw a flourishing of arts and culture. During his reign, the empire witnessed the building of opulent structures, the publishing of literature, and a great appreciation of poetry. After his death in 1629, the throne passed to his grandson. Unfortunately, his grandson seemed a bit more interested in partying than responsibility. With this, the empire began to weaken, and in the 18th century, the mighty Safavid Empire succumbed to internal strife and outside invasion. Persia, the area surrounding and encompassing modern-day Iran, was once ruled by the Safavid Empire. This empire governed over Iran during the 16th and 17th centuries. It marks the beginning of modern Persia. With its origin in Sufism, a mystical sect of Islam, the empire's religion was that of Shiism, a sect of Islam that believes all religious authority must come through the direct lineage of Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law. With its strong tie to Shiism, the empire was considered a theocracy, or a government formed and ruled by religious beliefs and rulers. Shah Ismail was the first ruler of the Safavid Empire. He freed the Persians from the Ottoman Empire of modern-day Turkey. As his name denotes, Shah Abbas the Great is considered the greatest emperor of the Safavids. Under his rule, he strengthened the position of the emperor. He also expanded trade, saw the building of opulent architecture, and ruled over a flourishing culture of the arts. Unfortunately, this era of prosperity would come to an end with the empire collapsing during the 18th century.
All right, so the slides we're going to do, it's a lot of the same stuff, frankly. But if there's something you didn't get down, the stuff in, that's underlined, that's definitely worth adding into your notes. So here we go. Sandwiched between the other Islamic gunpowder empires, the Safavids faced two major problems. They were on the Arabian Sea, but had no real navy. They also lacked natural defenses. Nevertheless, they rose to power in the 1500s due to their military might and strong leadership. According to legend, which again means it's probably a bunch of crap, a Safavid hero named Ishmael conquered most of Persia and parts of Iraq at the age of 15. So just imagine that for a second. I mean, most of you guys are like 15, 16 years old. Imagine conquering, a bunch of territory, leading an empire, having like a limitless power. It's kind of, it's kind of overwhelming to think about, but according to legend, that's essentially what this guy did. Ishmael was crowned the first Shah of the Safavid Empire. That is a word worth knowing, Shah. And it's just one of the many words throughout history that essentially means emperor. Even in the Muslim world, you've got different words for emperor based on, the language. We talked about the caliphates, the caliphs. They were emperors of the Abbasid Empire and the Umayyad and some of those other Arabic Muslim empires. Then you've got your kind of Turkic Muslim empires like the Ottomans and the Mughals that we're about to talk about. Well, their emperors are called sultans. Essentially the same thing. They're their political leader. They have a lot of ties to religion. but again, it's just an emperor. Well, in Persia, in the Safavid Empire, even though that they are also of Turkic origins, they're also of Persian descent. So in Persian, the word is Shah. They're almost interchangeable, but you need to kind of know what each of these words means if they come up, because they all more or less mean emperor. The big thing to remember about them, and we said it at the beginning, they went over it in the video, they stand out because while they are Muslims, they are not Sunni Muslims, they are Shia Muslims. And it was really, the use of that unifying religion that kind of held the empire together. The Shah was truly, both the head of the government, but also the head of the Shia faith. Problem is that meant that they didn't get along with their neighbors. They didn't really get along with the Mughals, but they hated the Ottomans. They fought them all the time. And it's one of the reasons that you have so much conflict between Shiites and Sunnis to this day. The one to know, the Shah to know, because it's nice to have a few people to point to and say, yeah, this guy, he was in charge at one point, is Abbas the Great. Ruling from 1587 to 1629. That's a really good run, especially back then. He's the guy that kind of ruled over the empire during their heyday, during their, I guess you could say, golden age. They had a conscripted military, very similar to the Ottoman use of devshirme and janissaries. They imported a lot of weaponry, especially, during this time period from European nations, which, guys, during the mid-1500s onward, they're becoming the big military powers. They're becoming the most technologically advanced civilizations. Old Abbas buddied up with people like the British, which you'll see later on. The British, continue to kind of meddle in Middle Eastern affairs. Over time, Abbas became the official head of the Iranian Shia religion as well as its politics. And guys, you still see that to this day in Iran. Iran is essentially still a theocracy, a government, supremely ruled by a religious leader. Now, it's kind of weird in modern times. In Iran, on one hand, they have a democratically elected government. They have a president. They have branches of government, kind of similar to the United States. But over all that, they have a person called the Ayatollah, who is both the supreme religious leader in Shia Islam and also technically the supreme political leader. So, the government, the representative government does the day-to-day governing, but technically the Ayatollah could do whatever he wants. That sort of trend in Persia and Iran, some of that can trace back to the Safavids. Old Abbas encouraged the beautification of cities, craft production, trade with Europe. This really is the golden age of the Safavid Empire. But like just about all the groups that we're talking about, over the last couple of days, you have this great ruler, like Suleiman the Magnificent with the Ottomans. We'll talk about Akbar the Great with the Mughals. We've got Abbas the Great with the Safavid. After they die, it's like they set a standard that nobody else could really live up to. And you start to see the Safavids, much like the Ottomans did, much like the Mughal will, slowly but steadily decline. The empire declined after the rule of Abbas due to the lavish lifestyles of its rulers, military overspending, and a weak economy, especially as less trade was dependent on, the overland trade routes. A lot of that revenue just seems to disappear. Eventually, groups like the Ottomans, groups like the Russians, which we'll get to the Russian Empire next week, start acquiring much of their territory to the point that the Safavids are essentially no more. So when you think about the Ottomans, think Turkey. You think about the Safavids, think Iran. Think about the Mughals, think modern-day India. The Mughal Empire was founded by a Muslim warrior named Babur in 1526. Babur was allegedly the descendant of some Turkic Mongols in Central Asia. And because he was kind of seen as part of that Mongol legacy, the Indian population referred to his dynasty, referred to his empire as the Mughals, which essentially, there was the Mongols. So there is a connection. It's a loose connection. He's a descendant. Again, this is 1526. The Mongol Empire kind of falls apart in the mid 1300s. So it's there's a couple hundred years difference. But still, that is why the name sounds very familiar, because it's part of that. They're descended from the Mongols. Babur comes in. He forms a centralized government, very similar to what you saw under Suleiman the Magnificent in Turkey about the same time. Even the government that you will see in the Russian Empire, which is forming during this time period under their first official czar, another weird word for emperor, Ivan the Terrible. But rather than Babur, the emperor, the sultan in this case, that you need to remember is Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great, who was Babur's grandson. He ruled from 1556 to 1605, and he is universally seen as the empire's most capable ruler. Under Akbar, the Mughal Empire was one of the richest and best governed states in the world. One thing to remember about Akbar, if you remember nothing else, very tolerant of others, very tolerant of other cultures, other religions, more tolerant than probably any ruler in the world at the time. Overseas trade flourished, with Arab traders conducting most of the commerce in the Indian Ocean during this time period. Remember, India had always been a trade destination. They had stuff that you couldn't get anywhere else, like pepper. Well, they really benefited from that. Traded goods included cotton textiles, tropical fruit, sugar, spices, precious stones, all of which were often exchanged for gold and silver. Especially during this time period, gold and silver that was coming in from the Americas. Guys, we're not there yet, but this is the same time period that the Spanish and the Portuguese are really colonizing the New World. And the main thing that really makes them successful and makes, the Spanish Empire, especially the richest empire in the world for a while, is they find a bunch of silver. Silver becomes so plentiful that it becomes kind of a globalized currency that's accepted everywhere. And it's one of the things that really, truly creates globalized trade. We're not there yet, but silver's one of those things that they're accepting everywhere because they see this as a valuable unit of exchange. And it just makes trade easier when there's one form of hard currency that just about everybody is willing to accept. The Indians of the Mughal Empire were no different. Trade within the borders were carried on by the merchant castes, who also participated in banking and the production of crafts. Now, you guys may not remember this, but you need to be at least somewhat familiar with the caste system of India. The caste system, at its core, is a very rigid social hierarchy that you see a lot during India's history, especially among the Hindu population, which most people in India still are. Under Hinduism, at this time, you were born into a social class. And that social class, or caste just means class, that social class determined who you could marry, where you could live, what you could do for a living, just about everything in your life. There was no social mobility. If you're born in this class, you're going to stay in this class, and that's what you get. If you're born in the merchant caste, you're going to be a merchant, and that's what you get. Again, there was no social mobility. There wasn't a whole lot of freedom. Here's the thing, though. In Hinduism, they believe in reincarnation. So the whole idea of the caste system is, you're put in this caste for a reason. That's where you belong based on what you did in your past life. In this life, if you live a good life and you accrue enough good karma or good credit, maybe when you die the next time, maybe you're reincarnated into the next caste up, or maybe even several castes up, until ultimately you're kind of released from this cycle and you join Brahman, the force. Guys, the caste system is really important to understand during this time period, because you've got a population that is mainly Hindu, that's mainly living under this very rigid social hierarchy based on their beliefs, yet they are ruled over by a Muslim population that doesn't believe in any of that stuff. That is bound to cause conflict. And through most of the history of the Mughal Empire, that's what it was. Akbar was different. Akbar was the guy that was like, man, we got to try to squash this. We got to try to get along, you know? And that's what I mean. You've got to look at him as especially tolerant compared to other Mughal sultans, but also compared to most rulers in the world at the time. So we got one more video. It's all about Akbar the Great. It's about 8 minutes. The full video is like 18 minutes, but we're only gonna watch the full video. If you want to, it is online. It's on Canvas. You know, it's pretty interesting. But really, the early part of the video is all about like military campaigns. And, you know, who all the Mughals had to conquer to set up shop. And I don't think we need to get into all that. The main guy that you need to know about is Akbar. So we are going to fast forward to about 8 minutes and 30 seconds or so.
Fleeting.
At this point, the Mughal Empire is in India. They're covering mainly the northern part. They came in and replaced the first group of Muslims that ruled over part of India, the Delhi Sultan. So they came in, they took over. They talk about some of the different groups that they had to subdue. At this point, you know, Akbar is just a kid. He's like 14 years old. His dad, the Sultan, dies. Now, for the early part of his career, he's ruling in name, but there's really this older guy that's kind of running the show. That is where we're picking up. I want you to pay attention to some of the things that he did. Some of the things that might get him the reputation as the Great. You don't get called the Great for the rest of history without accomplishing a lot of things. On one hand, he was a warrior. He subdued a lot of territories. He conquered way more territory for the Mughals than they had at this point, because this is really just the northern part of it. But also, he made a lot of reforms. He did things differently. He reorganized how things work. So again, as you look at this, because you do need to know a little bit about Akbar the Great, as you're watching this, just kind of jot down some things. What makes him so great? Once this is done, we'll kind of break it down, we'll simplify it, and then we should finish up pretty quick. There's not a whole lot left after this.
Within just a few months, the Emperor too would be dead, falling prey to illness and passing on the crown to the teenage Akbar. For the time being, the young regent served mostly as a figurehead, while his guardian, Bayram Khan, ruled on his behalf. The situation was precarious. The death of Akbar's father had once again weakened the crown and opened the floodgates to armed contenders. The Suris now swept back in, recapturing lost land and pushing on Delhi. One of the greatest adversaries to rise out of this period would be Hemu, a gifted Hindu general who was reported to have won over 20 consecutive engagements. His furious assault was on the verge of forcing the complete withdrawal of Mughal forces from the east. To make matters worse, the Mughals of the west, in Kabul, were facing their own invasion and proved unable or unwilling to offer help. To meet this crisis, Akbar and his guardian Bayram Khan re-marshaled the Mughal army in India. They then led this force out, striking at the most powerful of their enemies. Several encounters would follow, with another huge clash at the Second Battle of Panipat. Here, the fighting once again featured huge numbers of cavalry, gunpowder units, and armored elephants. The enemy general Hemu even personally led his troops from atop his tank of a war elephant and launched into the thick of the fighting. When Hemu was injured, however, his army despaired, thinking him dead, and fell into a rout. This great victory proved a turning point in Akbar's early campaign to consolidate his rule. Over the next 6 months, the Mughals would win several more major battles against their opponents, securing the important cities of Lahore, Multan, and Ajmer by 1558. Akbar's position was stabilized, but he had plans to do more than just that. In a departure from his father and grandfather, Akbar now ordered the relocation of much of his political infrastructure from Kabul to the east. India would be his domain. The young emperor was now 18 and ready to take on the full mantle of his position. As such, he dismissed his guardian Bayram Khan following a court dispute and ordered him to go on a Hajj to Mecca. The elder man took up arms in response but was ultimately defeated by a Mughal army, forgiven by Akbar, and soon after assassinated by an unknown enemy. Following this brief court intrigue, Akbar was now free to take the reins of the empire. He began by launching military campaigns into Malwa and northern Gondwana. These conquests successfully expanded the borders of the realm and brought with them many spoils of war. On the surface, it proved the continued strength of the Mughal military with its powerful elephants, heavy cavalry, and gunpowder units. However, beneath the surface, these campaigns revealed the fault lines within the Mughal nobility, as powerful figures squabbled amongst one another for pieces of the spoils and even challenged the emperor. The infighting proved so pervasive that there was even an assassination attempt on Akbar ordered by a noble in his own court. Something had to be done. To combat the fractious nature of this current system, Akbar launched a series of reforms aimed at centralizing the administration of the Mughal Empire. Some of the major changes included restructuring the civil and military ranks under the non-hereditary Mansabdari system, putting the emperor in charge of all appointments and promotions, paying officials directly from the imperial treasury or through land grants, creating new financial positions to supervise revenue collection, and reorganizing the network of news writers who reported important events to the emperor. While these efforts would take time to implement, they successfully transformed the Mughal Empire into a more efficiently managed state. At the same time, the military was also undergoing its own transformation. This was largely tied to the Mansabdari system we briefly mentioned. In essence, what it did was establish a clear, hierarchical system of ranks for military officers, each of which was in command of an increasing number of troops, starting from 10 men to as high as 10,000. Their responsibility was not just to lead, but also to raise these forces in accordance to specific quotas paid for by their salary. For instance, one might be obligated to maintain 340 horses, 100 elephants, and 400 camels, in addition to another 300 spare horses, 100 mules, and 160 carts. Thus, the Mughal military enjoyed a high state of readiness and quality, with armies being able to coalesce and mobilize quite quickly when needed. Akbar would go on to use this apparatus to conduct further military campaigns. The next major target was the land of the Rajputs. Its clans and kings had long eluded conquest due to their fierce reputation as warriors and their numerous strongholds. However, Akbar would succeed where others failed by a careful policy of warfare and diplomacy. The end result is that the Rajputs were allowed to retain control over their land in exchange for paying tribute, supplying troops, and acknowledging Akbar as their emperor. Furthermore, the doors of Mughal administration were open to the Rajputs, and many would fill its ranks in the years to come. This policy of conciliatory conquest would lead to unprecedented levels of cooperation between non-Muslim subjects and the Islamic Mughal government, which was to become one of the great legacies of Akbar's reign. In 1572, at the age of 30, Akbar launched new campaigns into Gujarat in the west, followed shortly by invasions of Bengal in the east. The emperor and his armies were victorious in numerous battles and succeeded in conquering the regions within 5 years. These efforts hugely expanded Mughal power as they took control of incredibly fertile regions with impressive industrial outputs and numerous seaports. The previously landlocked Mughals now spanned the entire breadth of India with control of trade hubs that granted them access to the far-flung markets of the east and west. This led to a huge commercial expansion, which was further encouraged by Mughal policies meant to stimulate trade, such as the levying of reduced custom duties, the improvement of transportation infrastructure, and the establishment of patrols and forts to safeguard trade routes. For the next decade, Akbar would preoccupy himself with settling domestic issues. Some of this involved military action aimed at crushing revolts or rebuffing incursions from its neighbors. However, much of it was aimed at uniting the far-flung lands of his religiously and culturally diverse empire. This was accomplished by adopting a policy of tolerance and reconciliation between groups. For instance, within the Muslim community, he would curb Shia-Sunni conflict and ensure that his government remained neutral when it came to internal sectarian struggles. When it came to non-Muslims, like the Hindus and Jains, Akbar abolished the jizya tax and lifted decrees which had previously been used to elicit forced conversions. All were also welcomed into his government, which led to an incredible degree of bridge building and cooperation between the faiths, which many identify as having contributed to the foundations of modern India. It's fascinating to also realize that many of these decisions stem from Akbar's own interest in philosophy and religion. Despite being illiterate himself, the emperor was a huge patron of learning who established many libraries and centers of education. He engaged deeply with the matters at hand, organizing and participating in lively discussions with theologians, mystics, and even atheists. Akbar sought to find wisdom in all teachings and is said to have adopted a wide variety of customs and holidays from his subjects. It's this sort of thinking that led him to actually reconcile the beliefs of many faiths through the creation of a syncretic religious movement called the Divine Faith. While this may have opened him up to attack from some of the Orthodox Muslim subjects, it went a long way in further promoting unity within the realm. Thus, Akbar came to be seen as a great philosopher king. However, we should remember that he wore many crowns and still remained a warrior king as well. This fact would become quite evident in the following decade. In 1581, Akbar's realm would come under attack from his relative Mirza, who was based out of Kabul. In response, the emperor led an army to repel the invaders, pushing them all the way back to Afghanistan and ultimately taking the region. For many years, additional campaigns were waged in these northern frontiers to conquer and pacify the area. In the 1590s, Mughal armies also gained control of Sindh and began to wrestle over territory with the Deccan sultans. Thus, by 1600, the Mughal lands of Akbar had more than tripled since the time of his father. Surely, the emperor had yet more ambitious plans in the works. However, in 1605, he fell victim to illness and died within a month, at the age of 49. He would leave behind an incredible legacy of conquest, diplomacy, and reform, which justifiably earned him the title of Akbar the Great. In the short term, his reign kicked off a new golden age and paved the way for further Mughal rule, which would soon encompass almost the entire subcontinent and last over 200 years. Their steward.
Again, a lot of reasons he gets that moniker, the Great. I've got a few of them on this slide. If you didn't get some stuff down, you may want to write some stuff. Now, this isn't everything, but this is definitely some of the bigger things that he did that he was known for. He, as they said, extended the empire greatly, like tripling its size, establishing the city of Delhi as his capital. He established a very efficient government bureaucracy and effective civil service. They talked about how he reorganized the government, reorganized the military. As Akbar's fame spread, capable men from many parts of Central Asia came to serve him because they wanted to serve him. He was kind of already growing to be this legendary figure. Many of them end up becoming zemindars. Zemindars are kind of weird, just weird enough to write down. They're paid government officials in charge of duties such as taxation, construction, and maintaining the water supply. Again, think of them just essentially as government workers, government officials, advisors. They're the people that kind of run things. Later, they were given grants of land rather than salaries, kind of like feudal, but were permitted to keep a portion of the taxes paid by the local peasants, similar to Ottoman tax farming, which again, sounds good, but when you put individuals in charge of collecting taxes and keeping some for themselves and giving the rest to the government, that just opens the door to corruption. It did in the Ottoman Empire. It does in the Mughal Empire as well. But Akbar did a lot of great things. He established a fair system of laws. You could appeal court cases all the way up to Akbar himself, much like you can, in the United States Supreme Court. The biggest thing, though, he was tolerant of other religions. On one hand, he's illiterate. He never learned to read and write. He's a warrior, he's a conqueror, but he's also very philosophical. He's also very curious about the world and especially about people's beliefs. Now, he's a Muslim, but he studied and sponsored, Muslims and Hindus and Christians and Buddhists, Everybody was welcome in his court, and he invited a lot of the experts in these faiths to come and just teach him about it. He was so tolerant that he abolished the jizya tax for non-Muslims during his reign, which is something you'd seen just about every Muslim empire do preceding him. He had a lot of conflicts between Hindus and Muslims, which of course there were a lot of. They talked about in the video, he even tried to come up with his own religion, the Divine Faith, that kind of blended all sorts of elements of Hinduism and Islam and some other beliefs as well. That doesn't quite catch on, but a similar religion does. A religion that blends parts of Islamic mysticism with Hinduism. Today, it's known as Sikhism. You need to know Sikhism is a syncretic religion, a blended religion of Islamic and Hindu beliefs. One of the reasons it grows in popularity is, he was tolerant of it. He let it grow. He sponsored, the building of Sikh temples, because again, religious tolerance was his thing. much more so than you'd see just about anywhere else in the world at the time. So Akbar, he's this great tolerant leader, this accomplished leader, you know, this uniter. But like the other empires we've talked about, you know, the Ottomans, the Safavids, really almost every empire in history, you know, sometimes you have a leader that's so great and so renowned and sets such a high standard that nobody else really measures up. And it's really after Akbar that you do see a decline in the Mughal Empire as well. But it doesn't mean they weren't still doing cool things. It's really, I believe, with Akbar's son, or maybe grandson, Shah Jahan, that you get probably the Mughals' most noteworthy piece of architecture, the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal, a lot of people think is a mosque. It's not. It is a mausoleum. This was a tomb for Shah Jahan's wife. Again, took many, many years to build, took a lot of money. It's beautiful to look at. It's a tourist attraction to this day. But during the time period of Shah Jahan, you know, the Mughal economy wasn't really flourishing, and spending, you know, a lot of money on lavish building projects like this probably wasn't the best move. But still, it did blend a lot of Islamic and Hindu styles. It is a beautiful building. It's one of the things that really lives on that the Mughals did. Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb. So I think this is either Akbar's grandson or great-grandson. It's probably his great-grandson. Rules for a while, you know, quite a while, 1658 to 1707. But he's not the man that Akbar was. Okay, by the time he takes over, maybe because of the Taj Mahal and other things, you know, the economy is kind of faltering. The tenseness has grown over the years because Shah Jahan, you know, definitely wasn't as tolerant as Akbar was. So he's kind of inheriting an empire that's already kind of in a little bit of turmoil. Thing is, he makes it worse. He's determined to bring all of India under Mughal rule. At this point, they ruled most of it, most of northern and central India, but the southern parts were still kind of self-governing independent states. He says, no, even though we're kind of running out of money, we're gonna launch military campaigns. He also decides all this crap about tolerance needs to go. Everybody needs to be Muslim. Okay, to heck with the Hindus. Problem is, most people were still Hindus. It was the ruling class that was the Muslims. He took a tense situation and he made it way, way worse. The result of all this is he drains the empire's treasury. He instigates peasant uprisings. During this time period, European nations are really starting to land on the shores of India. They had been previously, but now they're coming more and more. Nations such as Portugal, nations such as France, nations such as Great Britain. Guys, it's in that instability that the British show up and they start getting more of a foothold in India itself. I mean, at first it's just trading posts, you know, where they're kind of controlling the area. It's protected by, you know, their soldiers, but they're just trading, you know, they're buying and selling goods. But then because so many Indians start to work for them and start relying on them, I mean, they become almost the de facto government in the areas surrounding, you know, their trading posts. And then over time, as more and more people decide we don't like the Mughals, and because there was such an economic priority, such an economic tie to the British, they slowly but surely took more and more territory, and the Mughals, well, they lose more and more territory. And at a certain point, it's almost like the Mughals are kind of working for the British. Because again, remember, the Europeans are on the upswing. These gunpowder empires at a certain point start to stagnate. Now, one thing that I'm going to introduce is a group called the British East India Company. When the British are kind of starting to colonize India, it's not at first like the full force of the military. This is a company. This is a company that the British government invested in, that works for the British government, but it's not actually the government themselves. And that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. When we talk about colonization, it's usually not the British or the French or the Spanish, you know, their army showing up in full force and setting up shop. Sometimes it is, but it's usually a business venture at first, you know, and usually it is a private company that the government has a piece of that does most of the actual groundwork. Now, eventually the British will come in and directly take over. But in the early days, it was companies like the British East India Company that really did the legwork, helped to assert British dominance. And really, by the time we get to the mid 1800s, the British control almost all of India, and the Mughals are essentially done. The British will then rule over India, the Indian subcontinent, all the way up until the very end of World War II. It's kind of crazy, but you know, they kind of fell for a lot of the reasons that the other Islamic empires fell. They failed to modernize. They just couldn't keep up with the rising power and economic power of people like the British and the other European nations. Again, starting in the late 1400s, you start to see different European nations setting up trading posts along the coastline of India. Because remember, India was always one of those key trade destinations. Eventually, the British get powerful enough that they force most of these other guys out. And then over the next 100 years or so, I mean, you can kind of see here the areas kind of in in the beige. Those were areas under British rule. The areas that are pink, not really. Over about 100 years, they're gaining more and more territory. Until eventually, like I said, mid to late 1800s, they've got it all. This is just kind of an overview of why these gunpowder empires decline. And again, it's kind of just a mashup of a lot of the things that we've said, but you need to know the basic trends. The decline of the gunpowder empires resulted from a combination of pressure from European trading companies, from competition among heirs, sometimes motivated, especially with the Ottomans, by harem politics. Other factors include weak or corrupt leadership, failure to keep up with the advancements in military and naval technology, and the fact that, you know, a lot of these empires could no longer afford the expensive armies that allowed them to establish themselves. They were charging high taxes, the population was kind of upset with that, and you always had that prevailing conflict over religion. You know, whether it's between the Sunnis and the Shiites, of the Ottomans and the Safavid Empire, whether it's between the Hindus and the Muslims, you know, within the Mughal Empire, that sort of religious strife always caused a lot of tension and eventually led to some pretty tense instability. The last slide's just a chart. And again, there's nothing really new on this, but if later on you want to kind of review some of this stuff on your own, there is some really good information here. But this is on Canvas. I will leave that up to you. Again, originally we were going to do an SAQ over all this. The vocab and everything's still important. The notes are still important. They'll show up on a future test for sure. But we're not going to do the SAQ because we're getting towards the end of the 6 weeks, and that's just one more thing that you'd have to worry about. I really want you to focus your attention on having a rock solid notebook check on Friday. Get it done, get it in on time, make sure that you have everything in it. Tomorrow, we're going to start moving further to the east. We're going to talk about China. What's China doing after the Mongols go away? We will introduce two dynasties, the very last two Chinese dynasties in history, the Ming Dynasty, and then the final one, the Qing Dynasty. And it's kind of weird, the Ming Dynasty, they kick out the Mongols, they're flourishing for a while, they're kind of exploring, they're expanding trade, but then at a certain point they decide to isolate themselves. They decide, hey, we're the Middle Kingdom, we got it all, everybody wants to come to us, we don't need to expand anymore, we don't really need to trade as much as we once did, and they start to stagnate as well, kind of like these empires we talked about, just as the Europeans are very much on the rise. It's weird. It's a combination of things that happens, but we're entering a time period of true European global domination for many, many years, all the way up through the world wars. Pretty wild times. Other than that, y'all just kind of hang loose. I'm going to open up retakes at the end of the day. So if you haven't already emailed me or talked to me, if you want to retake this test, make sure that you do talk to me before the end of class or email me before the end of the day. I think I said, retakes. If you failed, obviously you're free to retake it. But if you failed because you turned it in, you submitted it way late, you can still retake it, but you're still going to be held accountable for those late points. So just kind of keep that in mind. Other than that, y'all hang loose.
I think we retake.
Yes, you can. I'll write it down.